Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Looks like the questions this week are only on Patreon, but I just want to remind everybody once again that anybody that supports is eligible to submit any question at all. Just please do it wherever the latest Q&A post is, wherever it is that you support. Just because the way these services work, I can't just click on comments and read through them. I have to go back in each individual one, and I'm sure to miss that way. So much easier if you just post any questions in the latest Q&A post. But let's jump right into it. I'm going to start with the newest question first this week, because why not? Frank Aguayo said he's been looking at getting a Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 arcade board to use with a supergun, a Hass. Do I need to get the soundboard as well, or can I just use the game board? Excellent question. Got to get the soundboard, and there's very often issues with the soundboard. So I'll just kind of run through my MK collection because I finally decided to bite the bullet and just get all of the MKs. I waited to get good deals on them. I'm not going to spend $1,000 on a board that isn't worth it as much as I love the game. So what I ended up doing was getting MK1, which was in perfect condition. I just needed some to make my own wiring harness for the kick harness. You'll probably have to do the same, although there are places that sell direct wiring harnesses. QC Retro, I believe, does. There are people that sell converters, but then you need to buy 2 wiring harnesses and the converter. It just seems like a waste. Unless you're somebody who has a large collection of boards that could use that stuff for other things, then that would actually be a good deal, but it sounds like you're just worried about these. Then on top of that, Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 have MK Plus, which is an enhanced ROM set that fixes some weird bugs that were always in the Mortal Kombat code, adds a bunch of cool features, and I decided to pick up those ROMs as well. And I'm glad I did, because not only is it a very cool enhancement, but my Mortal Kombat 2 board was giving very strange errors. It was kicking me back to the game over screen. I had Jose take a look at it. He fixed my soundboard for me, but we couldn't get that done. So I said, well, look, I was going to buy these anyway. Let's make sure it's not bad ROMs. And I removed all of them, put all the MK2 Plus ROMs in, and now it works. So the ROM chips were going bad in that. I don't know how or why that normally happens, but I've seen plenty of times that it need to be reseated and stuff like that. So that was certainly an issue. UMK3, sometimes I get horizontal lines across the screen, but to be honest, almost every arcade board I have has some kind of weird interference, and I just think it's because back in the arcade days you weren't going to notice, whereas if you're going through a capture card especially, or if you're on some high-end BVM that's already been calibrated, you'll probably see every little detail, so I wouldn't worry too much about those. And my MK4 board, not only did it need the ROMs reflashed, but I believe there was a trace that needed fixing. The only suggestion, Mortal Kombat 1, they're all pretty much the same quality. Get them with the soundboard working and you should be good. Mortal Kombat 2 has 2 main revisions. One that has actually 3 boards. The main giant board, a board that plugs directly on top of that main board, and then the separate soundboard. And I've heard people have had trouble with theirs. I own one of those, and I didn't have any issues with it. My problems were ROMs and soundboard based. So just make sure that whatever boards you get, they're tested and working. They come with all of the power harnesses and the special cable that goes between the soundboard and the main board. It'll get really costly if you have to start buying this stuff piece by piece. And other than that, really just enjoy it, because those are my favorite fighting games. MK1 especially, I don't know why it's not the best of the series. UMK3, you could probably call that the best, but 1 is still just my favorite. It's just something I've always really enjoyed playing. And of course, make sure you get whatever controller that you prefer to use. I just uploaded that video about manually wiring controllers, but there's a million other ways. The Mortal Kombat controller I used in there was a pretty good example too. So while that's not my favorite controller, I do think it's pretty neat that I get to use that with the original arcade boards. So, this was a much longer answer than the question you asked, but I wanted to make sure to give all the info for anybody out there who's just getting started in arcade boards. Because if you've already been doing this forever, this is all common knowledge and you're probably bored. Sorry. But if you're just getting into this stuff, there are basic tips like that would have been really helpful for people to know. I'm lucky enough to have friends that were, in the arcade scene since the beginning. So I have the luxury of just picking up my phone and texting my friends, and not everybody has that. So I wanted to share the knowledge I learned to try to be a help. Joaquin Coelho had a question about Neo Geo CD and the C-Sync mod I had listed on the website. And to be honest, your question made me go back and rewrite most of that page. Everything you did is fine. I'll skip to the end and say that, but I'll explain why in a bit. So for anybody unaware, the models of the Neo Geo CD that I've tested, and there could be more that I'm not aware of, I have had very limited experience, and I did say that in the page too, but the models that I'm aware of connect composite video to both the composite video and C-Sync pins on the multi-out. Now, if you're using a shielded RGB cable and your setup is compatible with composite video as sync, there's no difference whatsoever. There's no need to mod it. It's only an expert only type of thing. However, if you're not using a shielded cable, and you don't want to spend the extra money on one, totally get that. A good way to reduce jail bars is to either use composite or C-Sync, S-Sync, not composite video, or Luma. Now, if your issue isn't interference, if your issue is compatibility, so let's say you're running into an Extron crosspoint or the occasional RGB monitor, there's very few that I'm aware of that will not accept composite video as sync. It requires C-Sync. And if you're in that case, then you would need to do a C-Sync mod. And if you do the Luma mod, it's kind of useless because most of those devices like the Crosspoint won't accept Luma as sync. It'll only accept C-Sync. So this becomes kind of an expert mod, which is why I didn't put too much more information at first, because I very stupidly assumed the only reason people would stumble around that page is if they had very specific issues with their setup. So what the mod that I wrote does is it cuts the traces for composite video, and you add a tiny little jumper wire so that composite video is only going to the composite video pin and the composite video RCA jack on the back of the console, and not into the C-Sync pin on the RGB output DIN. And then I connect one pin of the Sony CXA that outputs C-Sync directly to that pin. Now, the reason I did that mod was because at the time I was using a device that both perfectly safe to send it high voltage TTL level sync, and it only used sync. It would not sync on composite video. And other people that might not, or that might be in this situation, or anybody using an Extron crosspoint switch, and occasionally one of those monitors, if you have, some of them prefer TTL, a lot of them have switches in back, 75 ohm or TTL. But I did over the years add wording in there, a few years ago at least, to say, hey, if you're plugging this into a SCART device, this voltage is too high. So depending on your cable, you're either going to want to add the components to the cable or right there on the mod. So one thing, the longer green wire on that page, if you were to just put a resistor on either side of that, it would have been fine. Now, I said 680 ohm. You said you tried 470 ohm. I think they're both within a safe range. I wouldn't be confident telling you that unless I looked it up on a scope, and I had long sold my Neo Geo CD, so I have no way to test that at the moment. But the issue that Joaquin had was when they did this mod, the picture was very dark. And I don't know if that's sync related, because for me personally, every time I've had an issue where sync was too low, it wouldn't have worked at all. So let's say you did that mod, and let's say by accident you used a 470K, so it's 4,700 ohms instead of 470. Let's just pretend for a minute that's what happened. I'm 99% sure that all that would happen is the voltage would drop so low that you would get no signal. I have no idea why the brightness would have changed. So there's obviously lots of other factors that I haven't tested yet. Maybe it's a different motherboard revision. No offense at all. Maybe you cut the wrong trace or something. I'm not throwing shade. I make mistakes every single day. So just saying, it's always a possibility. However, when Joaquin wasn't getting that working, all they did was just connect Luma from the S-Video connector over to the C-Sync pin, and that worked. And that is perfectly safe to do in every case exactly like this. There's an S-Video connector on the back, and you pull the Luma pin and move that directly over to C-Sync. That is safe because in that scenario, you know that there's no extra components required because it's just an S-Video DIN, so you would plug in an S-Video cable that doesn't have components in it. So that should be perfectly safe. If you were using unshielded cables, then it's going to clean up the interference. But if you were running into like an Extron crosspoint it wouldn't have done anything at all. And no offense, but if you were using a well-shielded cable, you probably didn't see any change at all because you probably wouldn't have gotten interference. There's a few different factors. You could be using a switch that's, I forgot the bandage switches sometimes have issues with that. So there's other little small cases where if you really understand the full scenario of all your equipment, that going sync on Luma could be a help. So what you did was perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It may or may not have helped depending on your setup. I just wanted to run through the whole thing for anybody that read that page before today and didn't understand why it was there. It was really just there for people that need TTL sync, and I just put it up there for anybody else that might need it. The only other thing, and this is just semantics, and this is me being annoying, but you mentioned S-Video being at 3 volts, and I'm pretty sure that's not right. And that doesn't matter. What you did is fine. Oftentimes people will hear a number and it'll stick in their head. So, don't look for 3 volts on Luma. I'm pretty sure it's 1 volt or lower, just like the rest of the video voltages. But so hopefully I made things clearer and didn't confuse them even more. But thanks for the post, and it really, it pushed me to update that page to make it clearer. And I hope you didn't waste your time. I mean, if nothing else, you didn't hurt anything, so you don't have to worry about that. But hopefully it did what you needed it to do. Par Strindeval said they saw some super cool component video cables on the Raspberry Pi analog output video. This is just the right length for your needs, and they look super nice, so I'd like to get the same kind. Do you remember where I got them? Yes, those are the HD RetroVision cables. In all of these videos, I linked to my Amazon page, so just scroll right down to HD RetroVision cables, and you can see they have plug-ends on both sides, and they have plug and receptacle if you need to use them as extension cords. And I'm always open and honest. The HD RetroVision guys are friends of mine, but anybody that's ever seen the old Retro Roundtable episodes knows that we are by far our harshest critics. So when I say that those are the best component video cables on the market today that you could buy on Amazon that I've tested, I mean it. This is not blowing smoke for my friends. I have put those things through so much brutal testing and they've never failed. So absolutely recommend them to anybody that needs just basic component video cables. They're fairly priced, especially if you know how they're made and the time that went into them. So I'm a very big fan of HD RetroVision in general, but it's at the point now where even friends I have that are still doing home automation setups that need analog video will buy their cables for their super high-end setups, because it's not just a video game thing. It's anytime you need a really, really good component video cable that isn't absurdly priced. And as far as I know, they don't perform any different than the ones that are absurdly priced. They're pretty darn solid all the way up to 1080p. So good eye, and the links are always there on the Amazon page. J Business says, longtime listener, first time supporter. I finally got around to setting up my Patreon and wanted to thank you for the content. Thank you. Honestly, I really appreciate it. Very often people in these questions throw some well wishes in, and I always try to thank them for that, but then the Q&As would be twice as long and they're already kind of wordy. But I wanted to take the time to respond to you because I just sometimes in these Q&As, and especially sometimes in my messages, if anybody that messages me through any of the support services, I want to respond to everybody, but sometimes I am swamped, up at 7, it's now 11:30 at night, I haven't stopped working, but I don't want to let anybody down, so I'll just reply really quickly, and sometimes it might sound snippy or short. I never mean it that way. It's just a choice between I'll either find the time to quickly respond or not have the time at all. So I figured people would just appreciate I very often get long questions with some very nice things said, and I'll respond like, these are the cables you need, with a link, and that's it. Because I just figured giving people the answers is probably better than having to wait a few days to get to it and then possibly forget. So thanks so much to everybody that supports. Thank you, J Business, for signing up for Patreon for this. I appreciate it so much. I hope everybody understands if I'm accidentally snippy, it's never on purpose. It's always just, I'm in the middle of something and I'm still trying to get back to you. And I don't think I've missed a question at all on purpose. I think the only time I miss questions in the Q&As are when I actually answer them and then delete the file by accident when in post or something like that. So thank you very much for your support. Any questions at all in the future, just ask exactly the way you did here, and hopefully I could be of a help to you. Victor is Perfect had a question about integrating composite video and S-video consoles into an existing RGB setup. And I read your question a few times, and I think I got it right, but I make mistakes all the time. So, pardon me in advance if I mess this up. But it looks like they have a couple of G-SCART switches, and they're currently going into a PVM and a FrameMeister and are considering eventually getting an OSSC as well. And they wanted to know the easiest way to integrate those other consoles. And for some of the consoles that you mentioned, like Apple Bandai, PCFX, Laser Active, it's probably better overall to not bother with mods and to just do what you're saying and use S-Video. And in this case, I would absolutely just recommend the Core U converter. That's the one that I reviewed a while back that takes composite and S-Video and just converts it to component. It doesn't turn it to component video quality. It's going to be the same quality, but at least you don't have to mess with different inputs or anything else. And if you have something like an OSSC, that could be completely automatic because even if it's component or RGB, you could set that to auto detect. And for a PVM, you just have to hit one button to switch between RGB and component. But your questions are a few things. So would running a Core U through a RetroTink comp to RGB work, and would it add lag? Yes, it would work. No, it wouldn't add lag, but I'm not sure why you would need the comp to RGB. You should just, if you're using a 2019 or later G-SCART switch, you should be able to use just component video through SCART. So you would just have to buy a custom cable that takes component video and left and right audio and outputs it into a SCART connector. And once again, that's not a converter, and the G-SCART switch does not convert anything. It just allows you to pass component through. And in fact, I believe Retro Gaming Cables even sells an Xbox SCART cable that is really just component video, but in a SCART connector for this exact same scenario. So that would work fine. It would also work perfect with the FrameMeister in that mode. But the only thing I don't understand is how you're currently integrating the other component video consoles. You say through G-SCART switches, so I just assumed that you were doing something like component through SCART using one of the newer G-SCARTs that can accept that signal and not be confused by it. But if I'm wrong, that's the only other option. So. Or the only other thing that I would need to know to answer the question properly. So if at least one of your two G-SCARTs is 2019 or later, my suggestion would be get a Core U and just use a custom component video to SCART cable, not a converter, not the RetroTink comp to RGB, and then everything should just work like normal. And the only thing you would have to do is on your target device, you might have to switch between component and RGB. If that's not the case, what you might want to consider is just getting a G-Comp switch and then putting all of those devices into the component side, and then figuring out the easiest way for your setup to integrate that into your other consoles. It might just be two different inputs on the OSSC and FrameMeister. It might be the same through a different kind of method to get it into your PVM. You'd really just need to figure out what's best for your setup. But the important answers to your question are the Core U and RetroTink transcoders don't add any lag even if you use them together. They're not buffering anything. They're just doing an instant signal change. Pear Sweden said, I know most people who use a Mister want a high-quality PVM or BVM, but they can be hard to find, especially in good condition. I was searching around for the best possible CRT, since that would most likely be cheaper, and found something called SED TVs, a new type of CRT that should have been released back in the start of the 2000s, but never was. Have I ever heard of it? Have I ever seen one? And do I know if anyone ever sold in the world? Yeah, you're touching upon a pretty incredible memory. I was lucky enough to work for a company where I got to travel all over the place, and I used to go to CES every year, and I was there at the unveiling of SED TVs. And this is, I think it was the year before OLED, or if it was the same year as OLED, it was when Sony only had their 11-inch model, not a big actual TV. And I was in the presentation room with my boss, and both of us were blown away at the quality of it. But the story of that was a deal between Canon and Toshiba. and they knew it was going to be the best. So they spent or they started to spend on what would have been like $1 billion factory to make these. And then as the factory started getting built, there was a fight between them about a patent dispute, and they canceled the whole project. So none were ever sold. I only got to see him that 1 year. When I got back from CES that year, I tried every contact I had to get a sample, because at the time we were doing medical imaging, so the highest resolution, best displays would have been part of at least one of the projects we were working on for our computers. And no, like you couldn't, there was nothing, you couldn't get anything. That was never let out of their labs as far as I know. And, the only interviews that I've seen of it were people at that CES or people that were really connected to the company. So I wish those made it. I don't know what the limitations would have been, because you never really know the truth. Their press release was it was a patent dispute, but how do we know they didn't start the manufacturing process and realize, like, wait, this isn't going to work. We'll never be able to get them over 30 inches. You never know what what really happened with that. There could have been an issue, but it looked insane. I absolutely thought it was one of the coolest displays I've ever seen. Now, over 10 years later, if I saw that next to a calibrated LG OLED, would I still think it was the best display? I have no idea. The answer to your question, though, the other answer to your question, and this is something, this is one of the only things that trolls get to me sometimes about. The one big misconception about retro gaming and getting the best is that you need a PVM or a BVM. And the truth is that you just need a CRT or a not crappy way to put it on your flat screen. So, the Rad2X and the RetroTink 2X only doubles to 480p. It's not the sharpest solution on the market, but there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't add lag. You don't get that shake from things that are from 240p signals that are treated as 480i. And, they're perfectly good solutions. And on the CRT side, any CRT with any input, in most cases, the only thing I would say against that is if you live in a city like I do, RF could be really noisy. And it's kind of funny because here in my apartment, if I plug in, a Super Nintendo, RF, and one game, it's totally fuzzy. But that same exact setup, same cables, same power supply, same consoles, same TV, when I brought that to any of the expos I went to do the demo, RF looked identical to composite. So as long as you're not in an area with tons of wireless signals, any CRT is great. And if you had a choice, try to find one with composite inputs, and then anything after that's a bonus. So if you could find a CRT with component video inputs, you could just use Mister's component video output, and you're going to get an amazing experience. If not, you got to find some kind of converter to go from RGB to composite or S-video, and Mike Chi just made his, and he's sending me one to test. So as soon as that gets here, I'll put it through its paces. So for anybody out there with a Mister or an RGB only solution, whatever that might be, that you want to get, a great CRT experience, any CRT will work. Try to find one with at least composite video, though, just in case. There's a lot of wireless networks in your area, especially if you're in an apartment building. And look into, I'll post about it as soon as I get it and test it, but look into the solution from Mike. And that'll be an excellent experience. And on the other side of that, there are those that argue that because that's what we had in the 90s, in 80s, that's what you should be gaming on. I don't subscribe to that theory at all, but what I will say is people that get PVMs and BVMs and use RGB get the sharpest picture and the best colors, but people that use composite video get to enjoy all of the composite blending artwork that the developers designed their games around. So, if I had to choose, I do prefer the sharp RGB solutions. However, I would always appreciate how a composite video signal looks, and especially in those things that one could argue look better on composite video. So, that's why I always tell any retro enthusiast, even if you have a full BVM setup, if you just keep your eyes open and find a free consumer-grade CRT laying around, pick that up too. You never know. Maybe you're going to use it once a year for 10 minutes, but still like it. So that's the whole rundown. I probably talked too long about this, but that's the story that I know of SED. That's my recommendations for CRTs. And also, you're another new Patreon subscriber, so thank you very much for joining. I extend the same thank yous and well wishes to you as I just did before, and thanks for your support. Matt Richtenberg wanted to know if there are ODE optical drive emulator options for the smaller PS1. They have one of the tiny screens that attach to it and would love to get an ODE to get the most out of it. No, none that I know of, and I don't think any are in the works either. As far as I know, for at least the short-term future, the only way to get any kind of ROMs running on a PS1, PSONE, is to use a mod chip and CDRs, and I don't think there's going to be a way to have any kind of ODE in there, at least for now. Who knows what awesome stuff people will come out with in the future. Also, for your other question about hooking up a PS3 to a VGA monitor, I talked about that last week. I'm not sure if you missed it, but it's around the 44-minute mark of the last week's Q&A, and it was kind of a longer answer, so I don't want to waste everybody's time with this. So if you wouldn't mind, please just reference that one from last week. Kelv SYC had a question, and my apologies, but I'm not quite sure what the question is. So I'm going to kind of explain things, and if I get it completely wrong, my apologies. I'll try to fix it next week. So basically, most consoles all work the same way in that first, a video game is a computer program, digital ones and zeros. And then the first time those digital signals are changed over to analog, they output RGBS. Now, there's obviously some exceptions, but roll with me here on this one. And that RGBS signal is essentially pretty similar to what you get in your RGB cable, but it needs some more preparing. So Nintendo on the Super Nintendo and even on the N64 for the models that are compatible, they send that raw signal into a chip that converts it. Now, Sega does the same thing, but Sega uses off-the-shelf Sony CX8 chips. And that chip does a couple of things. First, it amplifies the RGBS levels to what is properly needed inside of our consoles. Then it takes those red, green, and blue signals and sync and combines them together to form S-video. So the colors are all in the chroma pin, and then sync and brightness information are in the luma pin. And then it takes those signals and combines them together to make composite video, and then depending on your console farther down the line, it might combine that signal and audio to make mono audio and video RF. So that's pretty much the way it is with most consoles. Now, some consoles like the NES and the original 2600 generate their video a little bit differently, but it's the same thing in that it starts with a digital signal that's then eventually converted over to analog and then broken down that way. And that's why in the cases of both of those consoles, the mods took the digital signals before they became analog and then gets RGB from those. So technically speaking, whether you were to do it that way, so like let's say you had a console that is known to have very good quality composite video output, like the N64, and you were to just plug it in and take some video captures, or you were to take the N64 that's been RGB modded, let's say, or even an Ultra HDMI, but convert that signal to composite, they'd be about identical. However, there are some consoles that are just noisy, like the Sega Genesis. And if you did a triple bypass on a Sega Genesis, which in most cases disables composite video, at least on the noisier ones like the Model 1, and then were to do an RGB to composite conversion on the outside, you might actually end up with a better composite video signal. However, I would never recommend people go through all of those loops just for that reason. If it was a situation where you're sending RGB to your capture card and composite to game on a CRT, sure, because what you're really doing is the triple bypass so you get the good capture. You're not doing it to get the better composite video signal. And alternatively, on the other side of things, there's a few consoles released in France that said everything had to be RGB, that took composite video and converted that to RGB. And in some cases, that actually does look better than plain old composite, but not because it's a better signal, because it was only composite video when it was a few traces on the motherboard. So one of the things that where composite video gets its interference is the longer the cable, the more interference you get from it. So in fact, with any analog signal, usually, unless you have really good cables, if you have a long cable, you're going to see slightly better improvement than you using a shorter cable. And this is something anybody could test themselves. Go grab a 20-foot cable and a 1-foot cable, and you'd probably be able to see the difference depending on the situation. But so there were situations where that would look better because what you're actually doing is you're having the longer run of RGB, not a long run of composite video. But that's kind of getting into semantics. And once again, like I wouldn't recommend that as an answer for anything. And in fact, I wouldn't recommend getting those consoles for anything other than just collector's use. Like, look, here's a rare French model of this that, outputs fake RGB or something. So I don't know if that answered your question, and I very much apologize if it didn't, but that's basically the way I'd like to break it down. And for anybody that I may have confused in this is all just theory. This is all just talking about theoretically what would happen. I am absolutely not recommending anybody bend over backwards to do some kind of crazy RGB mod to get better composite video. I just kind of wanted to put it all in perspective. But I am kind of working on a project with somebody that touches upon this a little bit. But once again, it's for streaming scenarios only. So hopefully it was a somewhat okay answer to your question. Well, that's it for this week. I usually end with telling people where to post their questions, but I already did that in the first part, so I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody that supports. It's really your support that's keeping all the behind-the-scenes research and some of the crazy projects I'm involved in going, so thank you very much. While a lot of the in front of the camera stuff might seem like all it is that I do, there really is a ton more involved, and it's really you that's keeping all of this going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.